He was trained to destroy the enemy, yet in one impossible moment, he chose humanity over hatred. This is the story of the German pilot who risked everything: his mission, his freedom, even his life for a decision the world would never forget. The sky in 1943 was a place where mercy rarely existed. Every pilot who climbed into a cockpit knew he was leaving behind the world of rules and entering a realm where survival depended on instinct, precision, and a willingness to do whatever it took to live another day. For German fighter pilots, the pressure was even greater. They were the hunters of the Luftwaffe, tasked with intercepting vast waves of Allied bombers that crossed into German airspace like swarms of steel locusts. Each mission came with a grim understanding: fail and your cities burn, hesitate and your comrades die. The war had stripped the sky of softness. It had turned it into a brutal chessboard where every movement carried death consequences. Franz Stigler understood this world all too well. He was a skilled pilot, respected by his peers, and hardened by the constant grind of combat. He had lost friends, seen machines torn apart in seconds, and felt the cold familiarity of death brush past him too many times to count. By 1943, the Luftwaffe was stretched thin, and every experienced pilot like Stigler was worth his weight in gold. He knew the odds, he knew the expectations, and he knew that every bomber that slipped through his grasp meant more destruction on the ground. The war had conditioned him to see Allied aircraft not as human lives, but as targets, numbers on a tally, threats to eliminate before they eliminated him. On that day, when he scrambled into his Messerschmitt Bf 109, nothing felt unusual. The alarm had sounded, reports of incoming bombers were already flooding in, and his job was the same as always: take off, intercept, destroy, and return. The sky roared with engines, anti-aircraft fire, and distant explosions. High above the clouds, sunlight glinted off metal wings, while shadows of bombers crawled across the earth below like dark omens. The intensity of these missions left no room for emotion. There was only the mission, only survival. But even amid that chaos, Stigler's sharp eyes scanned for opportunity. His aircraft was fast, agile, and built to kill. He felt the familiar mix of adrenaline and cold focus settle over him as he climbed higher. Training and instinct guided his every move. His life had become a rhythm of takeoff, combat, and landing, repeated until the days blurred into each other. He expected to find a formation of B-17s flying in tight, defensive groups, each one bristling with guns that could tear a fighter apart in seconds. Those formations were deadly, and any attempt to break through them was a gamble with fate. Yet instead of a formation, he spotted something strange: a lone bomber drifting far from its group. At first glance, it didn't even look airworthy. Smoke trailed from one engine, the tail section looked shredded, and the aircraft wobbled unevenly as if fighting to stay in the sky. A wounded bomber meant an easy kill: no escort, no defensive formation, no risk. In a war where efficiency mattered, this was exactly the kind of target pilots were trained to neutralize without hesitation. And so, as Stigler banked toward the lone aircraft, everything in him remained focused on one purpose: intercept the enemy and finish the mission, just as he had done countless times before. As Stigler closed the distance, he could see the full extent of the bomber's suffering. What he had first noticed from afar was nothing compared to the brutal reality up close. The B-17 looked less like a functioning aircraft and more like a ghost of one, drifting through sheer willpower. Large holes were torn through its fuselage, like someone had taken giant bites out of the metal skin. The tail section shook violently with every gust of wind, barely clinging to the rest of the airframe. One engine was dead, another was coughing out smoke, and the remaining two looked overworked to the brink of collapse. It was a miracle the plane was still airborne at all. Stigler's fighter approached slowly, cautiously, because even a wounded bomber could be dangerously unpredictable. But something felt different. There was no return fire, no tracers streaking toward him, No desperate bursts from the bomber's machine guns. It was unnerving. Normally, the moment a fighter got close, the bomber crews would unleash everything they had, determined to defend their crew and aircraft. Yet this aircraft remained quiet, almost eerily still, as if it had spent the last of its strength simply trying to survive. When he leveled his plane beside it, he finally saw why. Through the jagged openings in the metal, Stigler glimpsed chaos inside. Blood, shredded wires, dangling oxygen masks, and men slumped over their stations. The tail gunner was motionless. Whether dead or unconscious, Stigler couldn't tell, but the sight hit him harder than enemy fire ever had. He shifted his position slightly, peering into the side of the aircraft, and saw more wounded men, some wrapped in makeshift bandages, others dazed and barely able to lift their heads, and then his eyes met the American pilot. The cockpit of the B-17 was shattered, glass blown out, instruments damaged, and the young pilot, Charlie Brown, looked exhausted, pale, and fighting to keep his aircraft under control. Stigler could see the strain etched into his face, the way he held the controls with trembling hands. It was the look of a man who had been through hell and was running on the last fragments of strength. In that brief moment, the sky seemed to stand still. Stigler felt something he had not expected, recognition. Not of an enemy, but of a fellow airman facing death. He had seen German pilots brought down in similar condition, clinging to life while their aircraft burned or spiraled toward the earth. War had taken so much from him already, but this sight, this raw humanity, cut deeper than he expected. He understood the situation instantly. This bomber was no longer a threat. It wasn't even a combat machine anymore. It was simply a flying coffin carrying young men who wanted nothing more than to go home alive. And for the first time on that mission, Stigler hesitated. His finger hovered near the trigger, but the certainty he had felt moments earlier began to fade. What should have been a routine encounter became something far more complicated. Because now, instead of a target, he saw people. As Stigler continued flying alongside the battered bomber, he felt a strange tightness in his chest, something he hadn't experienced in all his previous combat missions. He had seen damaged planes before. He had witnessed death, destruction, and desperation in countless forms, but this was different. The closer he looked, the more he felt the layers of his soldier's mindset begin to crack. Through the mangled openings in the fuselage, he could see the crew clearly now. The radio operator was slumped over, blood staining the floor beneath him. The waist gunners looked barely conscious, their uniforms torn, their faces ghostly pale. Every inch of the aircraft told a story of unimaginable struggle, a story that should have ended long before Stigler ever reached them. He knew exactly what must have happened. The bomber had been shredded by German anti-aircraft guns, torn apart by flak bursts that exploded dangerously close. Then the fighters had come, swarming like wolves, tearing through the already weakened defenses, that the plane was still flying bordered on the impossible, and yet here it was a wounded giant limping through the sky on sheer determination alone. As he studied the bomber, a memory surfaced, uninvited but powerful. He remembered one of his closest friends, a fellow pilot, whose aircraft had been crippled in much the same way. Stigler had searched for him for hours, hoping for a miracle, only to learn later that his friend's plane had gone down in flames, no survivors. He remembered the pain, the anger, the hollow frustration of knowing he couldn't save him. It was a wound that had never fully healed, and now, staring at the carnage inside the B-17, he felt that same ache, but this time layered with something deeper, an urge to protect, not destroy. He thought of his training, of the code passed down to German pilots before the war became twisted by fanaticism. His mentor had drilled it into him. Honor matters. Mercy matters. War doesn't erase humanity unless you allow it to. But those words had been buried over time, overshadowed by orders, pressure, and the grim realities of survival. In this moment, however, they resurfaced with startling clarity. If he pulled the trigger, no one would question him. It would be expected. It would even earn him praise. A kill was a kill, and a bomber like this easy prey, badly damaged, would add to his growing combat record. Yet the thought of firing into that crippled machine felt wrong in a way he could not ignore. These men were no longer combatants. They were victims of war, barely hanging on to life. Then came the chilling realization: sparing them could cost him everything. The Luftwaffe did not forgive acts of compassion toward the enemy. Pilots who showed mercy risked court, martial, imprisonment, or even execution. The regime he served demanded obedience above all else, and disobedience, especially in the face of the enemy, was considered nothing short of betrayal. Stigler felt the weight of that knowledge pressing down on him. On one side was duty, honor as defined by the military command, and the instinct for self-preservation. On the other side was a different kind of honor, older, purer, rooted in morality rather than ideology. He was caught between two worlds, and the choice he made would forever define the kind of man he truly was. In that silent moment above the clouds, with death hanging between both aircraft, Stigler knew he was no longer facing a tactical decision. He was facing a moral one, and moral decisions, unlike combat maneuvers, demanded courage of a very different kind. The weight of the decision pressed on Stigler with an intensity he had never known in combat. He had faced enemy fighters, outnumbered situations, even missions where he knew he might never return. Yet none of those moments demanded the kind of courage this one did. Destroying the bomber would have been simple. It was defenseless, broken, nearly lifeless. One short burst of 20 cannon fire and the bomber would fall from the sky like so many others. But sparing it, choosing not to kill, meant stepping outside the rules of war, outside the expectations of his commanders, and outside the boundaries of what a German pilot was allowed to do. He was not just contemplating an act of mercy. He was contemplating an act that could brand him a traitor. The Luftwaffe's code had changed since the early days of aviation. What had once been considered a chivalrous brotherhood of pilots had evolved into a hardened, uncompromising force shaped by ideology. Mercy was no longer seen as honor, it was weakness. Compassion was not a virtue, it was treason. Pilots who refused to fire or who helped the enemy risked immediate punishment. Stigler knew the stories, officers imprisoned, some even shot for disobedience. The thought of facing that fate sent a chill through him, more frightening than any dogfight he had ever entered. But then he looked again into the bomber. He saw the wounded navigator trying desperately to apply pressure to the waist gunner's bleeding wound. He saw the engineer holding onto a damaged oxygen line, doing everything he could to keep his crewmates breathing. And he saw Charlie Brown, barely conscious, his hands trembling on the controls as he fought to keep the plane steady. These were not threats. They were young men clinging to a sliver of hope, just as Stigler himself had clung to hope so many times. A war uniform did not change the fact that they were human. Somewhere, each of them had a family waiting, praying, hoping their son would return. He pictured their mothers, their wives, their brothers. He imagined the crushing grief that would follow their deaths. Then he imagined his own mother, who had already lost one son to the war. She had always prayed that France would not let the war turn him into someone he no longer recognized. With each passing second, the internal conflict grew sharper. He was standing on the edge of two opposing roads, one leading toward obedience, safety, and the cold efficiency of war, the other toward compassion, danger, and the unknown consequences of defying Hitler's regime. The easy path would have been to follow orders, to act as the war demanded. But Stigler felt that something deep inside him refused to let him pull the trigger. It wasn't just sympathy. It wasn't just a moment of hesitation. It was the awakening of something he thought the war had buried: his conscience. He heard the voice of his mentor echoing in his mind, a voice that had guided him in the early days of flying. Honor is not defined by who you kill. Honor is defined by what you protect. That one sentence cut through the fog of war, cutting through fear, confusion, and expectation. And in that moment, Stigler understood the truth. Firing would make him a soldier, but sparing them would make him a man. With the decision now solidifying in his heart, Stigler acted with a sense of resolve that even surprised him. He eased his Bf-109 closer to the crippled bomber, careful not to startle the American crew. The bomber shook violently in the air, its engines coughing and wheezing like a dying animal. Charlie Brown noticed the German fighter sliding into formation beside him, and at first his heart dropped. He thought this was the end. His plane had no defenses left. Most of his guns were frozen, jammed, or destroyed. The crew was half, conscious, bleeding, and hanging on to life by threads. If the German pilot fired now, none of them would make it home. Brown braced for the final blow, yet it never came. Instead, Franz Stigler held his position, flying wingtip to wingtip with the bomber. The two aircraft drifted through the cold skies in an eerie, impossible partnership. Brown stared at Stigler in disbelief. The German pilot looked back with an expression that wasn't hatred or triumph or bloodlust. It was something far more human, concern. Stigler gave a small, unmistakable gesture, a signal to stay on course, to keep going. Brown, confused but desperate, nodded weakly. Stigler knew he was entering dangerous territory. German anti-aircraft guns lined the ground below, programmed to fire at anything enemy. If the ground crews saw the bomber, they would blast it into pieces without hesitation. If they saw Stigler escorting it, flying beside it as if protecting it, the consequences would be unthinkable. Yet he pressed on. He positioned his fighter in a way that masked the bomber's silhouette, hoping to fool the gunners below into thinking both aircraft were returning German planes. It was a small chance, a fragile disguise, but it was the only hope the Americans had. They flew together like that, two enemies bound by an unspoken pact. Every second they remained in German. Controlled airspace increased the danger. Stigler scanned the sky constantly, prepared to intercept any German fighters who might appear and finish the kill he refused to make. He was ready to defend these American airmen, even if it meant turning his guns against his own countrymen. It was a thought that would have been unthinkable hours earlier, but now it felt necessary. Inside the bomber, the crew struggled to understand what was happening. Some were too injured to lift their heads, others too shocked to believe it. Only Charlie Brown fully grasped the miracle taking place. In the middle of a war built on hatred and destruction, a German pilot was doing the unthinkable, saving them. As they neared the edge of the coastline, Stigler felt his heart calm slightly. Once the bomber crossed the sea, it would be beyond the reach of German guns. It would still be a difficult journey home, but at least the crew would have a fighting chance. Finally, when they approached the safety of open water, Stigler made one last movement. He pulled his plane alongside the cockpit, met Charlie Brown's eyes, and offered a gentle, respectful salute, not of victory, but of humanity. Then, with a final look, he banked his fighter away and disappeared back into the clouds, carrying with him the knowledge that he had just risked his career, his freedom, and even his life to spare the men inside that falling giant. He had broken the rules of war, but he had protected something far greater, his own sense of honor. Years passed, and the war that had once consumed every breath of Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown finally came to an end. The world rebuilt, people tried to move on, and the memories of those brutal years slowly faded into the background of time. But for both pilots, that silent encounter in the winter sky never vanished. It lived on in their minds like a ghost, gentle, haunting, unforgettable. Charlie Brown returned home, carrying with him not only the trauma of battle, but also a mystery that would puzzle him for decades. Why had that German pilot spared him? Who was he? And what had driven him to such an extraordinary act in a time defined by violence? For years, Charlie wondered if the encounter had truly happened the way he remembered. He had been exhausted, injured, and fighting to stay conscious. Maybe the German pilot had simply lost sight of him. Maybe it had been a moment of luck. Or maybe, just maybe, a stranger had deliberately chosen to spare his life. But with no answers and no name, the encounter became a quiet legend he carried privately, a story he struggled to explain even to those closest to him. As for Franz Stigler, the burden of his choice followed him long after the war ended. He never told his superiors, his comrades, or even his family about what he had done. He kept it hidden not because he regretted it, but because he knew how dangerous it would have been to admit. In post-war Germany, many Luftwaffe veterans avoided discussing anything that might have been perceived as disloyalty to the regime, even if that disloyalty had been an act of human decency. So Franz buried the memory, locking it away as the world moved forward. But privately, in the quiet hours, he thought about that bomber. He wondered if the crew had survived their journey home. He wondered if they remembered him, and he wondered if they knew that he had risked everything to give them a chance. Then, nearly 5 decades later, as an older and wiser Charlie Brown searched through veteran associations, newsletters, and military groups, he decided to write about the strange moment from his past. He described the German pilot who had spared his life, hoping, just hoping, that someone out there might know who he was. That simple hope opened the door to one of the most unexpected reunions in modern military history. When Franz Stigler read Charlie's account, something deep inside him stirred. He knew instantly, this is my story, these are the men I saved. For the first time in his life, he told someone the truth. Messages were exchanged, details confirmed, and soon the moment both men had wondered about for so long finally arrived. They met face to face, and when they embraced, the weight of 50 years fell away. They weren't enemies, they weren't symbols of warring nations. They were two old men bound by a shared moment of impossible compassion. Their families witnessed something extraordinary. The bond between them was not one of battlefield rivalry, but of gratitude, respect, and a profound understanding of what it meant to choose humanity over hatred. They became lifelong friends, visiting each other often, celebrating birthdays, sharing memories, and honoring the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. Their story spread across the world, not as a tale of war, but as a testament to the power of mercy. It reminded people that even in the darkest times, a single act of humanity can echo for generations. And for Franz and Charlie, that act became the most meaningful legacy of their lives, a legacy stronger than nationalism, stronger than fear, and stronger than war itself. In the darkest chapter of human history, one pilot refused to surrender his humanity. Franz Stigler proved that real courage isn't just about following orders, it's about knowing when to rise above them. His choice reminds us that even in a world built on conflict, compassion can rewrite destiny. So let this story be a reminder. Greatness isn't measured by the battles we win, but by the lives we choose to save.